All right, so in part one, we barely got 2 pages in, um, and already we got to see the setup that Tolkien was doing here. The setting is the Fourth Age, about 100 years after the events of Lord of the Rings. Mankind has settled into peacetime and has become so satiated with what he calls goodness and peace, meaning the good times are rolling, that the youth wants to be mischievous and break things and ruin things just for the fun of it because they're bored. But it's more than that. It's a restlessness, and there's something wrong in the soul that we get into as we get closer to the end of where he pretty much couldn't keep writing, where he dropped the pen and was obviously saddened and depressed by what he was seeing in the generations that were coming after him. Right? Tolkien belonged to that great generation, what we call the Great Generation, that fought in World War I and later went through World War II. And then we had the boomers. What I find interesting to note is how the boomers were handed the keys to civilization by the Great Generation. The Great Generation did their job. Nobody's great, nobody's faultless here, but they did their job. They fought against something that was definitely a shadow in their time, and handed the keys over to the boomers wholeheartedly, saying it's your turn to take up the mantle, to take up the torch, you know. Yet the boomers to this day, I can't talk. 100 years after the First World War, refused to give up the keys to the next generation. Generation X has been totally passed over, and the millennials are probably going to inherit that mantle, and they've been more needy than the boomers. What we should have done as Gen Xers and millennials is do the same thing the boomers did to the Great Generation, which is turn our backs on them the way they turned their backs on the Great Generation and say, well, we don't like the way you're going with things and we're going to take the mantle up. But we haven't. We've let them pretty much have the run of things and boss us around and tell us what to do, and now they're pretty much going to just die off. That's the blessing, I think, of mortality for mankind, is that if they live too long, they get so rotten that they just start to make things worse. So at least we know there's a expiration date on humanity that allows for something new and fresh to come through, because sadly we don't progress, we regress. And that's a major theme of Tolkien in the Middle Earth, is the fact that in Middle Earth there isn't progression, there isn't advancement, there isn't they're not getting better and better, they're getting worse and worse. The Golden Age is the farther back you go. And honestly, I don't think it's really any different. I think that it's correct. I mean, along with that comes the fact that Middle Earth is impregnated with the stain or the blight of Morgoth. And that's the same thing with our Earth. There's something blighted within it that causes this decay, and it seems to be even in the soul of humanity, right? So we have Gen Z and the next generation after that, who it's our fault that we didn't stand up to the boomers, because now they're living in a world, a nightmarish world that was created by the boomers and that we have allowed, and that they are going to have to rebel against and fight tooth and nail to have any kind of sanity. And that's where we're at. And at the point of Tolkien, where he was at, he saw this with the boomers primarily, and those that would be coming after. And that's what this conversation is. So going back to Ceylon tells Borlas basically, when I was a kid, you corrected me for picking your fruit and stealing it just for the hell of it, not because I really was hungry or starving, but just because I could. And rather than Ceylon's reaction being a good person, a good kid, his reaction would be, wow, you're right, I feel ashamed, right? That's the biggest problem with our generations since the Great Generation, that we have no shame. We have no sense of like, shame is important because while it is used to manipulate people, it's also used to make you have a sense of humility and realize when you're wrong. You know, it has a good and a bad, like everything on the planet. So his inability to have shame at what he has done, which in this case is clearly bad. And I think Tolkien's point is that it's not bad because I'm offended. It's bad because you are ruining nature. You know, nature has a process. It's the same thing it's to Tolkien, you stealing the fruit and marring the tree for the heck of marring it for fun is just as bad as you grabbing any kind of an animal, a cat or a dog, and torturing it to death. You know, you're doing something now that's pernicious, that has something, a sense of just evil behind it, because you're doing it out of pleasure for hurting something else rather than doing it out of necessity because you need to eat or you need to survive. Now we're talking about something else, right? And so you should feel shamed when that's pointed out to you by someone who is older and knows better, and be like, oh my God, you're right, I'm wrong. I'm not going to do that again. I see the error of my ways. And just like Ceylon has no shame, we have no shame. Rather than feel ashamed, Ceylon says, no, I wanted to come back with my crew, my gang, my buddies, and trash up your entire house. Maybe even beat you, old man. That's what Ceylon is saying. This is in the 19. I don't even know when he wrote this right now. Obviously, it was later in his life. So let's say it was in the 60s or even the 50s. He was already seeing something that we are now literally witnessing in the streets 60 years later, you know. And he saw it. And that's why it's significant. Ceylon ended with a smile, right? Borlas was startled. He was now receiving confidences, not giving them. Right. And there was something disquieting in the young man's tone, something that made him wonder whether deep down, as deep as the roots of the dark trees, the childish resentment did not still linger. Yes, even in the heart of Ceylon, the friend of his own son, and the young man who had in the last few years shown him much kindness in his loneliness. At any rate, he resolved to say no more of his own thoughts to him. So Borlas realizes, uh-oh. You know, he could have been stubborn and been like, no, you gotta listen to me. I'm older than you. You should respect me. You should show some. He actually is keen and says, uh-oh, there's something wrong here with this guy. Someone that I've known, someone that's a friend of, the son of a close friend of mine. I'm gonna shut up. I don't feel I can trust to say anything more. I need to tread lightly. So, alas, he said, we all make mistakes. I do not claim wisdom, young man, except maybe the little that one may glean with the passing of the years, from which I know well enough the sad truth, that those who mean well may do more harm than those who let things be. I am sorry now for what I said, if it roused hate in your heart, though I still think that it was just, untimely maybe, and yet true. Surely even a boy must understand that fruit is fruit, and does not reach its full being until it is ripe, so that to misuse it unripe is to do worse than just to rob the man that has tended it. It robs the world, hinders a good thing from fulfillment. Those who do so join forces with all that is amiss, with the blights and the cankers and the ill winds, and that was the way of orcs. So, I mean, Tolkien is clearly defining what bad is, what evil is. He's not even blaming Ceylon for what he did. But saying, listen, I'm an old man. I've kind of lived through a couple of things that you may not have. So I may have learned a few things that you may not know. I'm sorry if what I said offended you. This is before like cancel culture. I'm even sorry if I offended you. But my point is true. My point is accurate. And the reason I'm upset, I'm even bothering to tell you why I'm upset. You're robbing the world of something from its fulfillment. And that's what the boomers have done to the consequent generations. And we continue to do so to the generations before us, which is what the great generation didn't do. We've been robbed of the world, and we've been hindered from reaching full ripeness. We've been plucked from the tree, unallowed to ripen. We have not been coached. We have not been tested. We have been thrown out there and told, all right, here's a little bit of money, here's a little bit of education, here's a little bit of this and that. And you do what you can with it. Good luck. You know? So this is a very important statement that he's making in that paragraph. Ceylon responds, and is the way of men too? No, he's not saying a question. He says, and is the way. So he said that was the way of orcs, right? So, I mean, the most decrepit, perverted things, the loyal servants of Morgoth, in a sense, that's what they do, right? They prevent things from coming to fulfillment. They cut it off. They pervert it. There's something wrong and disgusting about it because it's against the actual fulfillment of nature in its process. Well, this is the way of men too, says Ceylon. No, I do not mean of wild men only, or those who grew under the shadow, quote unquote, as he says, as they say. I mean all men. I would not misuse green fruit now, but only because I have no longer any use for unripe apples, nor for your lofty reasons, Master Borlas. Indeed, I think your reasons as unsound as an apple that has been too long in store. To trees, all men are orcs. Do men consider the fulfillment of the life story of a tree before they cut it down? For whatever purpose, to have its room for tilth, to use its flesh as timber or as fuel, or merely to open the view? If trees were the judges, would they set men above orcs, or indeed above the cankers and blights? What more right, they might ask, have men to feed on their juices than blights? So Ceylon is making the classic woke response that we get now, where it's like, well, we're no better than orcs. These people are no better than that people. They're just as bad. Men are just as bad as orcs. Is it any worse if you get to cut the tree because you need it for timber? You need it to use it to burn so that you don't die at night? From the perspective of the trees, the indigenous trees, we're just as bad as them, as orcs. We're exploiting them just as much. We should be ashamed. We should never touch a tree. You grabbing the fruit off the tree is no better than me doing it, whether you grab it when it's ripe or it's unripe. Wow. Wow, he saw that already at this point in his life. You know? So, what can you say? This is the argument. And this is exactly what he was afraid of, and what he was seeing, and what we are seeing now. A man, said Borlas, who tends a tree and guards it from blights and many other enemies, does not act like an orc or a canker. If he eats its fruit, he does it no injury. It produces the fruit more abundantly than it needs for its own purpose, the continuing of its kind. Ceylon says, let him eat the fruit then, or play with it. But I spoke of slaying, hewing and burning, and by what right men do such things to trees? You did not, says Borlas. You spoke of the judgment of trees in these matters, but trees are not judges. The children of the one are the masters. My judgment as one of them you know already. So now we're getting to the spiritual question of the one, right? Which actually he never does really in Lord of the Rings.